Every 40 seconds, somewhere on Earth, another human brain is struck by a stroke. Before you finish listening to this section, multiple families somewhere in the world will hear devastating news that changes their lives forever. Every year, stroke kills nearly 6 million people globally. It stands as the second leading cause of death worldwide and remains one of the primary causes of permanent disability. But the most terrifying part is not how deadly stroke can be, it is how often the warning signs are ignored. Because in a shocking number of cases, the brain does not stay silent before disaster strikes. Hours or even days before a major stroke occurs, the body often sends clear signals that something inside the blood vessels is going terribly wrong. The tragedy is that most people were never taught how to recognize those signals before it becomes too late. Modern medicine divides stroke into two major categories. The first is hemorrhagic stroke, where a blood vessel inside the brain ruptures and begins bleeding into surrounding tissue. Pressure builds rapidly inside the skull, damaging critical brain structures. These cases are often catastrophic and highly fatal. The second, and far more common type, is ischemic stroke. This occurs when a blood vessel feeding the brain becomes blocked, cutting off oxygen and nutrients to brain tissue. Within minutes, brain cells begin dying permanently. Roughly 85% of all strokes fall into this category, and to understand why every second matters, we must first understand the organ under attack. The human brain weighs only around 1.4 kilograms, representing roughly 2% of total body weight. Yet despite its small size, it consumes about 20% of the oxygen entering the body and nearly a quarter of all circulating glucose. The brain never truly rests. Every movement, memory, emotion, word, heartbeat, and decision depends on uninterrupted blood flow reaching billions of neurons continuously. Even brief interruption becomes dangerous. When oxygen delivery stops, irreversible damage can begin within 4 to 6 minutes. That is why neurologists describe stroke as a race against time, not metaphorically, literally. But perhaps the most important truth about ischemic stroke is this: most strokes are not sudden random explosions. They are the final stage of a process developing silently for years, long before a major blockage forms. Blood vessels gradually become damaged. Plaque accumulates along artery walls. Inflammation weakens circulation. Tiny clots form and dissolve repeatedly. The arteries feeding the brain slowly narrow while the body struggles to compensate, and during that long deterioration, the brain frequently sends temporary warning signals. Medicine calls these episodes transient ischemic attacks. TIAs. Transient means temporary. Ischemic refers to reduced blood flow. In simple language, a TIA is often a mini-stroke that resolves before permanent damage fully develops. Imagine one of the major carotid arteries in the neck slowly narrowing due to years of plaque buildup. At some point, blood flow becomes unstable. A small clot briefly blocks circulation to part of the brain. Symptoms suddenly appear: vision changes, speech problems, weakness, numbness. Then, minutes later, the blockage shifts or dissolves, blood flow returns, the symptoms disappear, and the person convinces themselves everything is fine again. But according to stroke specialists, that temporary recovery may represent one of the most dangerous moments in the entire process, because research repeatedly shows that a TIA often occurs within 72 hours before a major ischemic stroke. Those 3 days become a critical rescue window where permanent brain injury may still be prevented. The problem is that most people waste that window completely. They dismiss the symptoms because they were brief, because they disappeared, because they seemed strange but not dramatic enough to justify emergency care. And that misunderstanding may be costing millions of lives. One of the most terrifying things about transient ischemic attacks is how ordinary they can appear in real life. The symptoms often last less than 10 minutes. Sometimes less than 1 minute. A person can be standing in the kitchen, stepping out of a car, watching television, or walking to the bathroom when suddenly something feels wrong. Then, just as quickly, everything seems normal again. That temporary recovery creates a deadly illusion of safety, but neurologists view these episodes very differently. To them, a transient ischemic attack is not a harmless glitch. It is a fire alarm coming directly from the brain, and among the most important warning signs is temporary blindness in one eye. Patients often describe it the same way. A dark curtain suddenly falls over one eye. Vision becomes gray, foggy, or completely black for seconds or minutes. Some people think they stood up too quickly. Others blame fatigue, aging, or excessive screen time, but what may actually be happening inside the body is far more dangerous. Tiny fragments of plaque or small blood clots can break away from damaged carotid arteries in the neck and travel upward into the small artery feeding the retina. When that vessel becomes briefly blocked, blood flow to the retina stops momentarily, causing sudden visual blackout. Then the clot moves, blood returns, vision comes back, and the person feels relieved. What they often do not realize is that the same clot could easily have traveled slightly farther into a brain artery instead. The result then may not be temporary vision loss, it may be permanent paralysis, speech loss, severe disability, or death. Doctors even have a specific name for this symptom: amaurosis fugax, meaning fleeting blindness. Inside stroke medicine, that phrase is treated as a medical emergency because of how strongly it predicts future ischemic stroke risk. Hospital records repeatedly show the same devastating pattern. A person ignores one or two brief eye blackout episodes. Then the next clot becomes the catastrophic one. Another major warning sign is sudden numbness or tingling affecting only one side of the body. Patients often describe it as pins and needles, rubber-like sensation, heaviness, or strange loss of feeling in the face, arm, hand, or leg. The key detail is that it appears suddenly without obvious explanation, lasts briefly, then disappears completely. Many people confuse this with nerve compression from sleeping awkwardly or sitting incorrectly. But those situations usually involve posture and gradual recovery. ATIA works differently. The problem is not in the arm or leg itself, the problem is occurring inside the brain regions responsible for processing sensation from that side of the body, and because each hemisphere of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. Stroke-related symptoms often appear only on one side rather than equally on both. That distinction matters enormously. Then comes one of the most misunderstood warning signs of all: loss of coordination. Patients frequently describe it as suddenly walking like they are drunk despite consuming no alcohol. One moment they are stable, the next, they stagger sideways, misstep, drift into walls, or feel intense spinning dizziness without obvious cause. This often points toward temporary blood flow disruption inside the cerebellum, the part of the brain responsible for balance and coordination. The cerebellum sits near the back of the skull and relies on arteries traveling upward through the neck in what physicians call the vertebrobasilar system. When blood flow there suddenly drops, the cerebellum essentially begins malfunctioning temporarily. The body loses smooth control, balance collapses, movement becomes unstable, and because dizziness is common in everyday life, many people dismiss these attacks completely. They blame exhaustion, poor sleep, bad shoes, low blood pressure, but spontaneous severe dizziness combined with walking difficulty is something neurologists often treat as a possible vascular emergency until proven otherwise. Because once again, the temporary episode may not be the true disaster, it may only be the warning before it arrives. Perhaps the most frightening warning sign of all is when the brain begins losing control over speech itself. Everyone forgets words occasionally. People lose their train of thought when stressed or tired. That is normal human behavior. But neurologists are not concerned about ordinary memory lapses, they worry about sudden language collapse. A person may suddenly struggle to form words correctly. Speech becomes slurred, fragmented, or strangely delayed. They know exactly what they want to say, but the brain cannot organize the commands needed to produce clear language. Others experience something even stranger: words continue flowing, but the sentences stop making sense. Speech becomes confused, disconnected, almost like verbal static. In some cases, the person may not even fully understand what others are saying to them. This happens because language is controlled by specialized regions inside the brain. Most commonly in the left hemisphere, one area helps form and coordinate speech output. Another helps process meaning and comprehension. When blood flow to either region becomes unstable, language itself begins malfunctioning in real time, and if that breakdown suddenly appears and then disappears minutes later, Neurologists often treat it as classic evidence of a transient ischemic attack. The danger is not that the symptoms corrected themselves, the danger is that the brain briefly lost blood supply at all, because the next interruption may not reverse. Then there is another warning sign many people completely underestimate because it feels less dramatic than paralysis or blindness: unusual headaches combined with changes elsewhere in the body. One condition increasingly discussed in vascular medicine is vitiligo, where areas of skin lose pigment and become pale or completely white. Vitiligo itself is an autoimmune condition, meaning the immune system mistakenly attacks the body's own pigment-producing cells, but autoimmune disorders rarely affect only one system. Researchers have found that chronic inflammation associated with autoimmune activity may also damage the endothelium, the delicate inner lining of blood vessels. This endothelial layer normally acts like a smooth protective coating that allows blood to flow cleanly through arteries. When inflammation damages that lining, the surface becomes rougher and more vulnerable. Platelets stick more easily, cholesterol deposits accumulate faster, plaques begin forming, blood flow stability weakens, and over years, stroke risk rises. Now combine that vascular inflammation with sudden new headaches that feel unusually intense or different from a person's normal pattern. Neurologists pay close attention to that combination, not because every headache signals stroke, but because changing headache patterns sometimes reveal deeper vascular instability developing underneath the surface. This is where one of the biggest public misunderstandings about stroke risk becomes extremely dangerous. Many people believe normal cholesterol numbers automatically mean safety, but stroke risk is not determined only by how much cholesterol exists inside the bloodstream. It also depends on the condition of the blood vessels themselves. Think of a brand new nonstick pan. Food slides across the surface smoothly, but once that protective coating becomes scratched and damaged, material begins sticking aggressively. The same thing happens inside arteries, and one of the biggest destroyers of that protective vascular lining is chronically elevated blood sugar. Glucose is essential for life, but when blood sugar remains elevated for years, endothelial cells begin suffering microscopic damage. The vessel walls lose flexibility. Inflammation increases. Rough patches develop where cholesterol and clotting materials can attach more easily. This process often begins long before someone officially develops diabetes. Even prediabetes can silently injure blood vessels for years without obvious symptoms. Then comes smoking. Every cigarette introduces toxic chemicals directly into the bloodstream. Those compounds inflame artery walls, thicken blood, increase clot formation, and accelerate plaque buildup dramatically. This is why smokers face substantially higher ischemic stroke risk even when other health markers appear relatively normal. And perhaps most unsettling of all, much of this damage develops silently for decades before the first warning sign ever appears, until suddenly, one morning, the brain begins sending signals that time may be running out. High blood pressure has long been known as one of the strongest stroke risk factors in medicine. Years of elevated pressure slowly damage artery walls, weaken blood vessels, and accelerate plaque formation throughout the circulatory system. But what many people do not realize is that ischemic stroke often strikes not during extreme pressure spikes, but sometimes during moments when blood flow suddenly drops too low for already damaged arteries to compensate. Imagine a brain artery already narrowed by more than 50% because of plaque buildup. Blood can still squeeze through the narrowed channel under stable conditions. But if blood pressure falls sharply, especially during sleep when pressure naturally decreases overnight, circulation through that damaged artery may suddenly become insufficient. Then a small clot forms, blood flow stops, brain tissue begins dying. This helps explain why some people go to bed feeling normal and wake up unable to move one side of their body or unable to speak clearly the next morning. Stroke is not always explosive. Sometimes it develops silently in the dark while the person sleeps. Age increases this danger dramatically. After roughly age 50, stroke risk rises sharply with every passing decade. Long-term plaque accumulation, hypertension, diabetes, smoking exposure, and heart rhythm disorders compound together over time, slowly weakening the vascular system year after year. But stroke is no longer only a disease of the elderly. Medical records now show that approximately 10 to 15% of strokes occur in adults younger than 45. In these younger patients, Doctors often discover different underlying causes such as autoimmune diseases, clotting disorders, congenital vessel abnormalities, aneurysms, or trauma affecting blood vessels in the neck and head, and regardless of age. One reality remains consistent: the earlier warning signs are recognized, the greater the chance permanent brain damage may still be prevented. This is why the 72-hour window following a suspected transient ischemic attack becomes so important. Inside that window, doctors may still identify dangerous plaques, unstable blood flow, hidden rhythm disorders, or severe vascular narrowing before catastrophic stroke occurs, but timing matters. Stroke specialists strongly advise against ignoring even temporary neurological symptoms simply because they resolved on their own. A symptom disappearing does not mean danger disappeared with it. In fact, it may mean the body narrowly escaped disaster. Doctors also warn against self-treatment. Many people hear the word stroke and immediately think of aspirin or blood thinners. But this can become dangerous because hemorrhagic strokes involve bleeding, not clotting. Medications thinning the blood in that situation may worsen internal bleeding rapidly. Only brain imaging, usually through CT scanning, can reliably distinguish between ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke during emergencies. This is why professional evaluation matters so much, and once a patient reaches medical care, physicians often begin investigating three critical areas. First, the carotid arteries in the neck using specialized carotid duplex ultrasound. Doctors can measure blood flow and identify dangerous plaque narrowing, reducing circulation to the brain. Severe narrowing may require surgical intervention before a major stroke occurs. Second, blood sugar control. One of the most important tests is glycated hemoglobin, or HbA1c, which reflects average blood sugar levels over several months rather than only one moment in time. This test often exposes hidden prediabetes or diabetes quietly damaging blood vessels for years. Third, heart rhythm monitoring. Some strokes originate not from neck arteries, but directly from the heart itself. Atrial fibrillation, a chaotic irregular rhythm affecting the upper chambers of the heart, allows blood to swirl abnormally and form clots that can travel directly into brain arteries, and many people with atrial fibrillation barely feel symptoms at all. This is why Holter monitoring, continuous ECG recording over 24 hours or longer, becomes critically important for detecting hidden rhythm disturbances before devastating stroke occurs, because at the center of all this lies one uncomfortable truth: stroke is rarely random. It is often the predictable result of silent vascular damage accumulating year after year until finally the brain can no longer compensate. The most dangerous myth about stroke is the belief that it arrives like lightning from a clear sky. Modern medicine shows something very different. In many cases, stroke is not sudden chaos. It is a long process of silent vessel damage that often announces itself repeatedly before the final event occurs. The body sends warnings. The brain signals distress. Blood vessels struggle for years before collapse finally happens. The tragedy is that millions of people ignore those warnings because the symptoms disappeared too quickly to feel serious. But transient ischemic attacks are serious precisely because they disappear. They reveal that blood flow failed temporarily, then barely recovered, and once someone has experienced one of these episodes, the clock begins ticking. That is why stroke specialists emphasize urgency instead of panic. If temporary blindness, one-sided numbness, sudden speech breakdown, unexplained loss of coordination, or unusual neurological symptoms appear even briefly, the goal is not denial. The goal is immediate evaluation, because within that 72-hour window, there is still an opportunity to interrupt the process before irreversible brain injury occurs. Doctors may discover dangerously narrowed carotid arteries before they fully block. Hidden diabetes damaging blood vessels may finally be identified. Dangerous heart rhythm disorders can be treated before another clot forms. Blood pressure instability can be corrected. Smoking-related vascular injury can begin reversing, but none of those interventions matter if the warning signs are dismissed, and this is where prevention becomes just as important as emergency response. Keeping blood sugar stable protects the endothelial lining of blood vessels and slows plaque formation. Controlling blood pressure reduces long-term stress on arteries. Quitting smoking removes one of the most aggressive chemical assaults the vascular system can experience. Treating atrial fibrillation dramatically lowers stroke risk from clot formation inside the heart. These are not small lifestyle details, they are survival strategies, and perhaps the most important message in this entire documentary is this: do not wait for symptoms to become permanent before taking them seriously. A temporary neurological symptom is not reassurance. It may be the final warning before catastrophic damage occurs. That is why neurologists encourage patients to document unusual episodes clearly instead of relying on memory later. What happened? Which side of the body was affected? How long it lasted? Whether speech changed? Whether vision darkened? These details may become critically important during evaluation. The body often leaves clues before disaster. The problem is that modern life teaches people to minimize them. I was just tired. It must have been stress. I probably stood up too fast. It went away. So I'm okay. Those explanations may feel emotionally comforting, but biologically, they can become deadly because once a major stroke fully develops, the damage may no longer be reversible. Brain cells lost to oxygen deprivation do not regenerate easily. Paralysis, speech loss, memory impairment, and disability can permanently alter a person's independence and quality of life within minutes. And yet, modern medicine also offers hope. Many strokes are preventable, many vascular risk factors are manageable, many lives can be protected when warning signs are recognized early enough. That may be the most important truth hidden inside everything you heard today. The brain rarely fails without warning. The warnings are there: temporary blindness, one-sided numbness, sudden coordination loss, speech disruptions, strange neurological changes that appear and vanish. These are not random glitches, they may be distress signals from blood vessels already nearing critical failure, and if those signals are recognized in time, the story does not have to end inside an emergency room or rehabilitation center. Sometimes, recognizing the warning is what saves the brain itself.